Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us on a Friday evening. I know lots of colleagues and comrades are preparing for quite an intense weekend in this country. Of course, my few words of welcome are also on behalf of the entire team of BAC, who, I cannot stress it more, as always have gone beyond and above the call of duty, and I'm extraordinarily grateful for their work and indeed comradeship. Now this is the third day of Propositions 9, deserting from the culture wars, and I just would like to share very few remarks about the convergence point within which we are meeting. At least two projects that I would like to mention. One of them is, of course, the project Trainings for the Not Yet, which is an exhibition as a series of trainings for a future of being together otherwise, convened with a multiple of collaborators by artist Janne van Heeswijk, who is also here with us. With the stress to this notion of being together otherwise, because it's precisely that yearning for another world, the yearning for another future, to allow myself a bit of poetic language, this yearning for the not yet, what has prompted the entire series of propositions for non-fascist living that we at BAC run as a research itinerary since 2017. Now, these propositions for non-fascist living are indeed prompted by resurgence of fascisms in their historical and contemporary guise, which actually brought us to engage with serious critique of the conditions at hand, but most importantly to create kind of constellation and circumstances within which we can learn from one another, imagine and practice together collectively another form of relationality. And I think this is really at the core of where we find ourselves at this very moment, also with this compact assembly of this evening. Now, propositions number 9 focuses or centers or zooms into the ideological combat today that we at BAC believe could be addressed as culture wars. The idea behind this series of gatherings is train one another in the afternoon trainings as to what are the options to desert positively from the culture wars. What are the ways, what are the options, if at all, to desert and actually create forms of organization on, to use that word, our own terms. Of course, this is the evening before quite an intensive weekend forthcoming in the Netherlands, which also could be seen through this prism of culture wars. Of course, we witnessed over the last couple of days immense intensification of threats and organized violence against anti-racist organizers and activists who are working to eliminate the Dutch blackface tradition of Zwarte Piet. And I think it's very important we bring that into our conversation. And also the fact that one of many people being targeted by this violence is Mitchell Assayas, who's current BAC fellow, who has been targeted for being affiliated with Kick Out Zwarte Piet. And I just want to stress, I cannot stress it more, that we at BAC fully support Mitchell and the activist work by himself and his colleagues and comrades to eliminate racial oppression in the Netherlands and beyond. This session is co-convened with Sven Luteken, who's an art theorist, writer, curator, and senior research advisor at BAC. And I would like herewith offer the floor to him for more in-depth introduction. Thank you, Sven.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you, Maria. Other forms of relationality, that's a term that Maria just used, which is indeed also very much what today is about, the entire program. But I think within this day, both the training session and the lecture tonight, we really focus on other forms of relationality, also specifically in relation to the family structure, the nuclear family. We had a wonderful repro communal training camp this afternoon with Transformella Malor, who is an avatar of the artist Johannes Paul Räther, and we will be getting a report in a few minutes from that training camp and about Transformella Malor and their activities in general. The repro communal training camp, which is related to a series of repro reality hack labs organized by Transformella Malor, investigates, problematizes the family and in particular the increasing outsourcing of reproduction, of the labor of reproduction to the global south. Due to new reproductive technologies, there's sort of forms of neo-colonial reproductive tourism that are happening as we speak. And in this session, in this afternoon's training camp, we, for instance, examined and discussed a number of diagrams made by Transformella Malor / Johannes Paul Räther, showing various types of family, various phases of the family and of reproduction and reproductive labor, from the modern or modernist family to the postmodern family to the contemporary situation. Those diagrams show indeed forms of relationality, ways in which family life and reproduction are organized. This can be seen in synchronic terms, but it can also be seen in diachronic terms, which is also something we got around to discussing at a certain moment. So indeed, the ways in which reproduction is planned, also expectations, desires that come into play, and the forms of temporality that such forms of desires can produce. For instance, the desire to see yourself, to recognize yourself in your own offspring, to create your own offspring, to reproduce yourself, and to perpetuate a certain type of family, of nuclear family, and a certain lineage. So there is this also temporality that is involved with reproduction and with the reproduction not just of life or of your own family tree, but also with the reproduction of a certain type of social structure, a certain type of family. Temporality is also something that very much features or will feature in Bini Adamczak's lecture, The Promises of the Contemporary. So here we have this notion of the promise. So Bini Adamczak argues that the promise that capitalism once held out rings hollow to many people. Society has become reduced to competition between atomized men and women, right? These nuclei that ultimately then compose the nuclear family, but you can decompose the nuclear family even more to these atomized men and women. And then it is only the family now that appears to remain as the natural support system, right? The natural support system in the absence of much other forms of solidarity, collectivity, and support that have eroded. And then Adamczak will argue that so far as it is fascist promises about a restoration of the traditional gender system, nationhood, or racial supremacy, it is these fascist promises that have proven the most successful. Right? We see the decline of traditional promises about life, about one's children having it better one day. And it is these fascist promises about the restoration of the traditional gender system, nationhood, and raciality, racial identity that have proven the most successful. with the reassurance basically being that you may lose your job or your apartment at any moment, but you can cling on to your masculinity or your whiteness. And then the question, of course, is how can alternative or emancipatory promises and narratives be developed? This notion of relationality, of relational form, is also crucial to Bini Adamczak's work, particularly in her recent book, Beziehungsweise Revolution, a book that so far exists only in German, but that I hope will also be translated into English soon. One of her previous books, Communism for Kids, does exist in an English edition by MIT Press, which is also warmly recommended. Bini Adamczak is a political philosopher and queer gender philosopher whose work indeed deserves to be far more well known outside of the German language bubble, I would say. And I'm thrilled that we can hopefully make a little contribution in making that happen. Before Bini Adamczak, then the floor is Transformella Malor's with a report on and a contextualization of the repro communal training camp that we were privileged to have this afternoon. So the floor is yours.
Good evening. Thank you for inviting me to this beautiful place that we shared this afternoon. At my repro communal training camp, which Sven has already mentioned, is a series of gatherings that bring together theories and practices that traverse identity making, which I call identitecture at some times, repro tech, a critical analysis of cryofreezing, surrogacy, and in vitro fertilization, and what it entails for the species and these ideas of family that we cling on to, I would say, as well. I will try to introduce ourselves, myself and others, first, because it contextualizes why I, as us, am speaking as this form and not as another. And then from there I will give you a small introduction or a small summary into what we did this afternoon. My name, it was said, is Transformalor. Transformella Malor. Transformalor. That name is real, but it's just one sign for my body, for this bio body that's beneath this skin. It's just one identifier, one sign for a multiplicity of others, of other artificial, of other constructed skins, identities that are entangled, enmeshed, covering, supported by this bio body. So how is my name linked to a body that was called Transformella, which you see in this image here? Who is Transformella? What kind of being is it? Is she me? Am I her? Are we us? is I, us. She is a surrogate mother of potential futures, a repro-revolutionary of ovulofactories, and so am I. My body, Transformalor, here, now, in the present, is, but tomorrow, I will have been Protectorama, a witch, a worldwide witch, a smartphone Zangoma. Today I am not me alone, I am also Protecto XX. This is an idiot of which machines, Protecto alum, as well as I, as me, is a rare earth occultist and a techno-alchemical being. I am the being of a swarm. I am Schwarmwesen. Schwarmwesen researches and writes as a herd, a flock, a group, a formation. We, I as us, call ourselves self-sisters, avataras or potential identities. Others name us ridiculous tricksters, idiots and traitors of identity and gender, family and nation. Traitors of what they call this reality we share, common reality. I as we, on the contrary, me and them, work towards the notion that in common reality, in this reality, and the etymological core of common is mean. That in this mean reality must be betrayed for something else, for a potential other real. The potential of an unredeemed real that's not yet. An unredeemed real that is slumbering within the mean, normal, common reality. So I, as us, am constantly precipitating this other real, these other identity-specific realities. From the infinite and multiple potential realities that there are. And I share them with my formations. I share them with my peers, with you now, or with the Repro-Techno tribe earlier today. I share them for these unredeemed realities to become common, as in communal, because this is the other etymological core of common. It's not only mean, but also communal. We do not come from another world, nor do we come from another time. You could imagine I as us more like a vessel into these constructed, into these communal, into these potential realities. But we also embody them in the here and the now, in the here, now, in the crystallized form that simultaneously configures another order while it's mean and common. So we produce potentiality against reality, sort of an enmeshing of these two forms at once. And it poses the problem, how do I report from all of me when we are not present at once, but can only be entangled with these images, this selfie war of ourselves in these rather complicated host-symbiont relationships of a biobody and its covering skin, made up by natural and constructed identities, or natural and constructed bodies, or designated identities, a more fabricated taxonomy. What is it? How to report when my as our name to body to identity relation is distorted, when our body to language to reality to relationship is unstable. How to document what might be better described as a self-generating, irrationally meandering mythology. For me, there is always diagrams. Diagrams always help, as Sven has already mentioned. They help to construct potential reality. They're drawings of the real when there is no structure. So in our potentiality, I call the order of beings identitecture. Identitecture is our constructed, continuously evolving genealogical tree. It's our organigram of an experimentally and techno-organically sprawling herd of ourselves. Identitecture records the forkings, the separations of myselves. It frames our names, appearances, crystallizations, assignments, sites, and methods. All of that is contained within that diagram. It's our reality construction. Through it, I as us understand my as our forking, our process of separation. We partition ourselves, reproduce versions of ourselves, manufacture as yet another proxy identity, a proxy identity of being. I oscillate with my body all across the spectrum of us. I as us is self-constructed lifelines. To me, they are independent timelines of repeated becoming and collapsing. When my body is temporarily wrapped in a specific skin, a condensed and accelerated process of construction and destruction of myself as other is taking place. I speak as specific being for a brief moment, becoming them, giving them a brief and intensified lifetime before peeling off this very skin and then becoming another to myself again. I'm in skin in one moment to be off skin in the next moment. These distorted timelines I have started to record, research, and write as body time or skin time. However, all the concepts, all the ideas that propel identitecture, and therefore its own conception of time, come from specific identities, needs, aims, sites, and acts. And since I as us is a multiplicity of timelines, constructedness, of narrative devices, and of a constructed time and space continuum, this space relation can be specific to each of our figurations. I was made as my older self called Transformella, the ur-mother of the repro research Avatara species Transformellae, which I'm a part of as Transformalor. As the queen of debris, Transformella generalis was born, crystallized, put together in these white teaching caves. Her research was dedicated to the processes in which biodigital capitalism transforms the way we reproduce things, beings, and therefore ourselves. Her focus was the triangulation of biotechnological industries such as surrogacy centers, fertility roads, cryotechnologies, and egg cell markets, and how they enmesh themselves with the jet plane network, airline industries, how they are fueled by communication through the internet. So to research, Transformella eventually left these white teaching caves and went to find what she suspected to be an emerging reproductive colonialism. She went to see the surrogacy centers in India, where she found a global elite of repro-technological early adopters, internet users, and economy-class fertility tourists getting their babies produced by poor Indian women. There, in India, she met a meta-mother, Dr. Naina Patel, which she from then on, as me, called the first utero-capitalist on an emerging global fertility market. And she found Dr. Naina Patel, the first meta-mother, immersed in a human-machine mothering triangulation. And this is Dr. Naina Patel, as far as I can see. She called her meta-mother because it's a technological mother. She's drunk with desires, a machinic, hormone hatching, a networked and an industrial distributed mother, a new reproductive icon, a new mother totem. She rises in the reproductive colonies in the midst of what I, as us, call a reproductive revolution. Reprovolution. Reprovolution. It became clear to Transformella that she needed to construct her own devices against reprogenetic, modernist, industrial class relations, against the utero economy and its cell circulation services, against a globalized reproductive industries capitalizing on economic segregation. Devices, however, I, as us, would propose more in an expanded sense. And what we did today in the Repro Reality training camp, you can here see an image of one of the hack labs, is also a sort of device, a psychoactively or psychorealistically transformed gathering, a social platform, and most importantly, a speculative platform in the most positive sense of the word, that take on this thing that we call repro reality, this mutating and updating techno-social structure. This thing that we also despise as the bio-digital family. But we are psychorealist researchers and no academics. I, as us, am a research avatar, if anything. I, as us, cannot work without experimental methodologies. And so, without being immersed in various communities, I, as us, cannot exist. The idea that I am an individual is very alien to me. There's a strong interdependence of being artificial like I am. I need a lot of help to become this way. So I, as us, as Transformella, as this bio body with the identity carrying Johannes Paul Räther, I roamed the metropolis of white genetic supremacy. And I visited its sites of care work. I, as us, preached on its streets corners against biodigital repro-colonialism. And parallel to researching and teaching, our practice evolved into constructing of a repro-techno tribe, a social and communal device, a social gathering, a platform, to organize reproduction on a societal level again. And guided by Transformella's repro-communal manifesto, and with the Repro Reality Hack Labs or the Repro Reality training camps, we are in the process right now to try to appropriate the techno-sexuological machines for our means. And that means, to quote Transformella, let's use the techno-sexuologic machines for an attack. And I mean an again and again and again and again attack on the nuclear family. We want to procreate outside and parallel to romantic relationships. We want to construct multi-sexual, multi-gendered, and technologically assisted parenting groups with 3, with 5 or more individuals of various cultures, backgrounds, milieus, and social strata. We will construct techno-progressive communeering, become repro-communal mothers of a techno-reproductive tribe. Join, all of you, join the repro-communal reprovolution. And then she forked. Then she forked herself, separated herself into a new version of herself, which is me. And here I am. And I would like to give you a small test of the relation that can be formed with an artificial identity, such as me, by trying to access my identitarian memory. This is a practice, it's a process, a score that we performed also this afternoon, and it's very dependent on the amount of people that try to access. So I want to try this as a more practical thing, because as an identity, as an artificial identity, of course memory poses as a problem. Because if I evolve and if I become my other self, how do I found myself on memory if I don't have any? If I start with a clean slate, I'm a new being. But as a forked being, I have still the materials, the data set that make myself. And this data set is stored on this device. This one here is my data body. It's a device that I constructed to keep my memory intact when I fork. Can you see it? There. And you, as my reprotribal formation, can connect to this device with your screen body. You can connect. My data body is an self-constructed and rather open device that you can connect with your screen body. So if you want to take out your screen body on which you store all your data, your messages, your images, your identity, your data identity, if you want to take that out, can you take it out, please, and show it to me? Yes. And if you want to connect to my data body, you can find its wireless network, which is called Transformella. Try to find it. Try to find your Wi-Fi settings and connect to Transformella. So we will see if all of us can access at once, because this data body is actually for rather small groups. But we'll try to access all of us. We'll try to make this connection all of us. So it's Transformella network, and then you go to your browser. You go to your browser, and you put in the address, and this is important also for Android user, please put my name in the address, which would be Transformalor or Transformella. You can use both. And then put an IO after. IO. In, out, into my data body. In, out, Transformella, in, out, I-O. And then press enter. Can you find it? Are you in or out? Out. In? Who's in? Transformella I.O. So with Android users, .io, yes. And with Android users, please try it again. Android users always need a little stroke, and then it works the second time. Mostly works the second time. And the Google phone users, they usually Google Transformella I.O., but that doesn't work. So it has to be in the address. Who's connected now? Well, that's a pretty good amount. Nice. So my data body contains all the memory that Transformella made, all the yeah, can you see it? Should we wait for the others? All the memory that Transformella made for me and all of the things that I have done so far. So I'm trying to follow you there. And now I would like to follow up on what Sven told about the diagrams and go through some relational diagrams of reprovolution with you to show them to you. So they are located I have to log in myself. Okay. So you can see the index, and on the very top of the index there's a version number called 4.6.6.14. And it's the Utrecht communal training camp. You can click that link and you are in the stash of material that we used at the training today. So all of this material we've been looking at, most of it, and when you find the number, yeah, what is it? And then the images, it's, I can't see it. That's true. We used the better diagrams. You're right. Okay. So go back, please. Go out of Utrecht. Go to Berlin. The Berlin is 4.4.6.13. No, 12. Sorry. It's called Berlin Repeat. Sorry. We used better diagrams. We have to look at the better diagrams, and they are stored in repro architectures. And there. Are you there? Who's there? Wow, cool. So there you can see this diagram of relationality, which is modernist. It's very straight. Everything is in line, stacked up beautifully and normally on top of one another. It's kind of a depiction of heteronormativity. Everything is a block, and it's squeezed. So all of the relations that we have in procreation and reproduction are there: the legal, the religious, romantic, ideological, heterosexual, genetic, biological, and they create the reproduct, as I call it, the child. When we go back and go to repro postmodernism, it's already a bit more lofty, a bit more fragmented, if you want. It's more open, and some of the connections are missing. There might be still a genetic connection and a biological connection, but there might be not so much of a legal or a sexual connection between partners producing ein Reprodukt. And it's definitely distorted in the way how we think about the reproduct as an owned, as a property, as a thing that maybe more happened to you than you own it. So this is called the Patchwork Family, something that happens still a lot, as much as the repro-modernist family still happens. And maybe it unlocks a bit more when we go to this next diagram, which is called the reprovolution. And here we have the deviation through a third body, a fragmentation of the relationality of reproduction that can entirely circumvent certain terms of relation, that can basically go around a third body, which would be an economic connection, to create a reproduct. So in that diagram you can see the going around, going around that the economic relation of procreation creates. The last one is where we end, maybe, and then I can already give the floor to Bini arriving, and it's maybe a beautiful bridge to her Beziehungsweisen. The last diagram shows the Beziehungsweisen, the relationalities of reprovolution, which is collectively disrupted, which we as a formation, as the reprotechno tribe, appropriate reprotechnology in order to create new subjectivities, beings, terms, and vessels. There you can see support mothers, you can see mother vessels, you can see the donor mothers, you can see the meta mothers, which are actually repro architects, and sexuality or romantic love are entirely exorbitant, extradited from this relationality. They can be machines, they can be humans, they can be gendered in various forms. It doesn't matter. And if you look at it a bit more from afar, you can see that it's constructed like a molecule. And I would end with this metaphor of technological reproduction, hopefully being much more like essences, atoms, elements connect to one another by various relations, connections, chemical bonds. And by creating chemical bonds, change their appearance, their texture, their surface to such an extent that we can't say this is the same material anymore. So if we look at silicon, for example, connecting to oxygen, it becomes stone. While silicon is a metal and very shiny, stone is this entirely other structure. And we would never say it's the same. But the chemical bond created by its molecules is setting it apart from the same substance. And this is how I as us, how we imagine the repro-tribal connections in the future. So we have differences that are almost entirely non-visible as the same, non-understandable, non-readable as the same elements connecting to one another in various different ways. So thank you very much. This is my report, and I give to Bini, I guess. Are you ready? Almost.
So welcome everybody. Thank you for the introduction that I unfortunately missed, and also for the last remarks in Transformella's talk. I'm very sorry that Natasha and I came late. It was due to the train situation, the general train situation. And, well, just to jump into it, even though you have been discussing already for quite some time, it's the third day, I think, I still would try to give some general remarks, to draw some general outlines on the current situation that we find ourselves in, or to put it in simpler words, to the mess we are in. And by doing so, I hope to broaden a bit the perspective or deepen the analysis, because there are some connections that we often miss to see in our everyday struggles, especially against this common evil of fascism. And this, as far as I understand, is the general question trying to answer and discuss here: how to have a non-fascist living, how to be able to live in a non-fascist way. And broadening the perspective for me would mean to go back a bit in history, and this for me means a starting point in 1989, 30 years ago in 1990, which is the fall of the Iron Curtain, the fall of the Soviet Union. And I think to understand the situation we're in, this is a good starting point. It is a point where the Soviet Union collapses and the capitalist West succeeds, and it's a situation which many think is the end of history. This is how the liberal philosopher Francis Fukuyama put it. He says, history has now come to an end. That's what he stated in 1993. Has come to an end, and representative democracy, representative capitalist democracy has finally won over every alternative. So there is no alternative anymore in history, and history has come to an end. And I would state that now, 30 years later, there's almost nobody anymore who believes that this is still true. It has become very obvious in the last decade that the end of history itself has come to an end, and that history is open again. I would say it is open again since 2011, since the Arab Spring, the Occupy movements, and the following movements that shattered the world. But the reinvention of history, the reopening of history, is an ambivalent situation that we find ourselves in, because history is now open again, but in different directions, and mainly in two different directions: a progressive one, an emancipatory one, and a reactionary one, longing to try to re-establish what they believe was a beautiful past of domination. So what we're seeing is the return of some of the ugliest undead of history, namely fascism, neo-fascism, neo-Nazism, or what some people call right-wing populism, which is, I think, not a very accurate term. So my question is, where is this neo-fascism, this ugly undead, these zombies from the past, where do they come from? What are the cracks in the conditions of the present that open up to allow those specters to return? And what makes them attractive? You know, because we have been discussing the neo-Nazi movements a lot. We know about their methodology, we know about their organizational structures, but the question remains, what makes them attractive? Where do they come from? To which questions do they provide answers, or what kind of promises do they make? What makes them attractive? And to answer this question, I think it's also important to go back in history, this time only 10 years, to the world economical crisis. I think in order to understand the return of fascism and neo-fascism, this is our main starting point. the world economic crisis happening in 2008, 2009. Because this crisis was not only a crisis of the economy, but it was also a crisis of ideology, a crisis of the neoliberal ideology. It was a crisis of the economy, financial crisis, but it was also a crisis of the legitimacy of neoliberalism. It was the neoliberal ideology that came into crisis. The neoliberal promise. So what is the neoliberal promise? The promise neoliberalism makes to the people in order to gain their support. I would state the promise that neoliberalism makes is to each individual, you can make it on your own. You alone can make it. If only you focus completely, entirely on your own career and your own family, then you can succeed and you can find happiness. This also means if you do not succeed, if you do not find happiness or wealth, it's entirely your fault, right? So this was a promise of individual wealth and self-realization. We know all the slogans. Find yourself, be true to yourself, create a better version of yourself, and so on and so on. And I would say that this individual promise lost its attractiveness, lost its appeal exactly in the moment the crisis hit. Because now you could see in the media pictures of people who had to leave their homes and all of a sudden were forced to live in tents, right? Maybe you remember the pictures in the US that were really strange pictures because it was the same, the people moved out of their houses and now were living in the tents while the houses were all of a sudden empty. Still, the houses were empty, but people were not allowed to live in them anymore. Like from a Marxist perspective, you could say like use value and exchange value fell apart. The houses had no use value anymore because nobody was living in them. Still, they had exchange value, they had a price. And it was exactly the price tag or private property that was now living in the houses, but not any longer people. People were living in the tents. And at the same time, you saw, for example, in Europe, pictures of people, images of people who were no longer able to pay their electricity, to pay their medical bills, even though they were hardworking. And this had always happened, as has always happened in neoliberal capitalism. But now it was happening on a large scale. And it became clear that this was not an individual failure. It was not one after the other losing their jobs. People were losing their jobs all together. They were all together in this shitty situation that they were not able to pay their electricity. So this could no longer be blamed on the individual. So what the crisis then brought back was a realization that had long been repressed. The connection of the separated, of that which is separated in capitalist society. All of a sudden, you realize those different parts of society that all the time seem unconnected, disconnected, they belong together, they come together. So, in a way, what came to mind, what came to the public opinion, what was realized now by many people was something that sociologists or people dealing with statistics had been describing for the last 30 years before. Namely, that a small amount of people in the global north and the global west had gained a massive wealth, while the majority of people were of worse. Their situation, their economical situation had worsened. But during the last 30 years, the global north, the global west had seen almost no economical growth, very little economical growth. And this means that the increase in wealth of the rich 1% was not due economical growth, was not due a surplus in production, but was due to a redistribution of wealth. This means class struggle from above. And in the US, you can show it very, very clearly that the percentage in which the wealth of the wealthy had risen, the wealth of the 1%, was the same percentage as the wealth of the poorer 50% decreased. It's the same. It's exactly a parallel movement. The 1% gets richer to the exact same amount that the 50%, the poorer 50%, half of the population, gets poorer. The thing is, as long as nobody wanted to see themselves as part of a poorer majority, as no one wanted to believe themselves to be part of a group, of a class, this statistical knowledge had no effect whatsoever, because everybody still tried to believe they were individuals, they were part of the middle class. You know? Everybody had this ideology that they were somehow successful. And this changed with the economical crisis. Because I would argue that this is like a very strong characteristic of the neoliberal ideology or the neoliberal condition, that it fragmentizes the society and cuts through the relation between society and individual. In the neoliberal condition, you do not see the connection between the individual and the collective, but you live under the fantasy that you are disconnected, that you are autonomous. There's one thing that I often do in workshops, is I ask the people, you know, where do you see yourself in 30 years, for example? Do you think you yourself as an individual, you will be better off, your situation will have worsened, or it will be the same? And then I ask, and where do you see society? You think in 30 years society will be worse, it will be the same, or will be better? And it's very clear that almost everybody thinks they themselves will be better off, and everybody thinks society will be worse. And if you do it all together, you see something cannot add up. You know, we cannot each, as individuals, be better off, and all together be in a worse situation. So this, you can do it as an experiment, but I also think with the economical crisis, it's exactly this knowledge, it is this revelation that came to mind. This is what people realized. There had to be something wrong. So what returned with the crisis of 2008 was, first of all, society. The society that which Margaret Thatcher claimed did not exist. Maybe remember this famous quote by Margaret Thatcher. She did it in the 80s, I think, when being interviewed by Women's Magazine, and she said, "There is no such thing as society. There are only individual men and women and families." For me, it's always very striking, because this is a quote quoted very often. People usually quote, "There is no such thing as society, there's only individuals." But that's not what Margaret Thatcher said. She says, there are individual men and women and families. So gendered individuals and families. This is basically what neoliberalism thinks is society. You know, this is what it is made of. Gendered individuals that can find shelter in a family in which they can retreat in order to fight off the dangerous public situation. So the public, the general society is constructed as something hostile, as competition, it's dangerous, and then we find in the family our little private home that we have to defend, probably even with our guns. So as long as everything went kind of well with the economical process, this is what individuals could believe in. You know? They could all go their own ways, telling each other at dinner parties that they had nothing to do with each other. And as long as the shop was running, this could somehow work for many of them. But when the bubbles of speculation finally burst, so too did the fantasy of individual autonomy. And then also something very interesting happened in this situation. Maybe you remember 2008, 2009, the Obama administration stepped in. They said some banks are too big to fail, and they created this huge, this massive bailout program. And it's very interesting because before, the ideologues, the economical ideologues had always claimed the state has to remain out of everything. State is only there for, let's say, a bit of infrastructure, mostly military expenses, but that's that. Now, when the crisis hit, they thought, oh, well, we still have this society thing, we still have this state thing, maybe they can now deal with this situation. So in a way you can say, this is in socialism, first you have socialization, and then everything falls apart, and in capitalism everything falls apart, and then you have socialization. You know? So all of a sudden, when the question of liability came up, society was dug up again. And this was a point for many people. They thought, okay, this could be a chance, this could be a way out. All of a sudden we remember, there was such a thing as a state, somehow it's powerful, maybe we can use this. And for some people this was already an alternative that all of a sudden was showing up, an alternative to neoliberalism. And those people thought we can use the state, we can use this power of economical regulation to end the era of neoliberalism in order to reinstate the society, the era that prevented neoliberalism, that came before. And this is Fordism, namely social democratic Fordism. This was the hope of the social democrats in a way. And maybe a word to this era of Fordism, because it's not as commonly used as neoliberalism. Of course, it goes back to this industrialist Henry Ford, who not only had the idea to technologically revolutionize the assembly line, you know, to have this very strict and normatized production of cars, but he also had the idea that every worker should be able to buy a car that he has been produced, so mass consumption, and also that the workers would be more disciplined and would work betterly if they would live in a disciplined environment. That is the nuclear family, the patriarchal family. So you could sum up the social democratic ideal of Fordism was mass production, mass consumption, and a patriarchal nuclear family. And this Fordist society, or this social democratic society, had its own promise that was very different from the promise of neoliberalism. And it was only given to a certain part of the population, namely white men. And there it said, hold still, you know, obey, do what you are told, then you have a good chance to be better off than your father. There is economical growth, there is progress, and if you do what you are told to, you will be better off than your parents, your father. This promise, of course, was made with an eye towards the Soviet Union. There was the Cold War, so they were still trying to compete with this system. It was a promise based on the exploitation of the global South, colonialism or the post-colonial situation that enabled this economical growth. And it was based on the widespread exclusion of women from the labor market, hence the patriarchal family with the husband working outside the family and the wife working inside the family, but for unwaged labor. And this was also based on the increased exploitation of migrant labor. Migrants coming to the global north, working for less money, so a racialized capitalism. The high growth rates that the Fordist economy was able to realize between, let's say, the 1930s and the 1970s, this is basically the Fordist era, allowed this Fordist promise to be maintained for the several decades without affecting the relation between classes. Because this is like the compromise that the social democracy was able to install in northern societies, inequality, yes, but on a higher level, right? So everybody was better off, but the relation between the classes remained the same. Some people were still better off than others, but since everybody was increasing their wealth, this was not so much problematic. But at the end of the 1960s, this class compromise, this social democratic class compromise, fractured simultaneously from several sides. The world economy experienced its first major crisis in a long time, in 1967, and shortly afterwards, social clashes broke out in many northern countries, clashes that had already been raging in the south for a very long time. The anti-colonial struggles for liberation that had challenged the world order now reached the metropolises of the West and the East, and that means simultaneously in Paris and Prague, in Belgrade, in Berlin, and in Berkeley. So the struggles that had already been happening in the South now came to the North. And those struggles made it clear in 1968 that a large part of the population was no longer willing to accept this social democratic compromise, the social democratic promise, which is an exchange of freedom for security, right? Obey, give up your individual rights, give up the ability to self-determine your living conditions in order to be secure and to participate in economical growth. People were not longer willing to accept this deal, and so the social democratic class compromise lost its appeal in 1968. Despite several attempts, this promise could not be rehabilitated even in the current crisis, even after 2008, especially when talking about Europe. This is partly because social democratic parties themselves started dismantling the social welfare in the 1990s. Remember, there was Blair in the UK, there was Gerd Schröder in Germany, and there was Hollande, for example, in France, who even in 2015-16 dismantled the welfare state in France. And they amalgamated the rhetoric of liberation with that of flexibilization. They often came from the struggles from 1968, but once they were in power, of course, forgot a bit about that, and did not care so much about alienation anymore, but now cared about the nation. This is what happened especially in the 1990s with New Labour. It was the discourse of globalization, and each of these new labor parties, social democratic parties, argued that reforms were needed, that the old social democracy was no longer possible under these new conditions of competition on a global scale, and that therefore reforms had to be made, and these reforms meant flexibilization of the labor market, struggle against the unions, and so on and so forth, so that the labor costs could be reduced, and also that the tax should be cut, especially for the wealthy, so to create better conditions for the capital. And why? Because if capital found better conditions, they would start investing again. This would create employment and hence economical growth, and then the old social democratic compromise could be reinstated. So on the one hand, they were right, because exactly you could see that in the 90s, the profit rates were getting better due to the tax cuts, the flexibilization, the worsening situation of the unions and so on. But on the other hand, the other part of the promise, namely employment and economical growth, did not happen. Right? So they failed to materialize this second part. To summarize the condition of the social democracy in the 20th century and the beginning of the 20th century, this is like especially around 1914, the First World War, the social democracy had abandoned the aspiration of overcoming capitalism. They had abandoned their revolutionary ideals. But now, at the end of the 20th century, in the 1990s, they even abandoned the claim to socially moderate capitalism. First, social democratic ideology had bet on the welfare state, and then in the 1990s, it bet on the destruction of the welfare state. The destruction of the welfare state was very often realized by social democratic parties. So social democracy said farewell to class struggle on its own accord. But under the new conditions, social democracy is no longer even needed for its own class compromise, because without stable growth rates, social democracy lacks an economical basis. And that is exactly the reason why, despite the crisis of neoliberalism, social democracy is crashing in Europe wherever it was once strong. For example, in Germany it's very clear, but also in other countries where social democracy was strong in the last decades, it is now, falling apart. And I would argue that the economical reason for this is that there is no constant growth rate anymore on which the social democratic class compromise could be organized. So this finds us now in a situation that the neoliberal promise of individual autonomy has lost its appeal. It has become obvious that is and has always been a lie. And at the same time, the Fordist promise of social democracy cannot be reinstated because it lacks economical conditions it would need. And this, I would argue, is the situation in which the rise of the right happens. This is exactly the situation where the right comes in with its very special promise it makes. Because the crisis we're facing also creates a constant fear of downward mobility, a fear of losing one's job, losing one's status, losing the position you're holding in society. And the promise the right makes, only of course to a certain part of the population, is join us and we will secure your standard of living at the expense of the weaker. We do not promise that your living situations will be better, but we will secure them on the cost of those who are weaker. This message of the right is directed outward as well as inward. Because when the right carries out their sexist and anti-Semitic and racist attacks, it at the same time it communicates something towards their followers. And it's a very different image. It's not an image of hatred and contempt, but it is an image of a secure fortress of family, nation, and race. And this is something that already in the 1980s was described or discovered by the queer theorist John D'Amelio, whose analysis in understanding fascist ideology I want to bring back in the current situation, because I think it is very helpful to understand the material groundwork for those ideologies. Because what John D'Amelio did was to try to understand where anti-feminism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, and so on come from. And his argument was that those ideologies are not based in stupidity. And their reason for those ideologies is not that people lack of education, or that a simple shift in our cultural relations would be able to make rid of those ideologies. But he argued that those ideologies, namely anti-feminism, sexism, and so on, are rooted deeply in the fundamentals of our social relations. And in here, it is exactly the family and the relation between the family and the market system that plays the important role. What Emilio tries to do is to analyze the role of the family in capitalist society in comparison to the role that the family played in pre-bourgeois time. And he analyzes, and this is a very Marxist move, he analyzes the family as a unit of production. He says the family in pre-bourgeois time states that it is able to fulfill the needs of all the members of the family. Everything, almost everything the members of the family need can be produced by the family. But at the moment capitalism is developed, some parts of the labor that has formerly been, or work that has formerly been organized in the family are taken out, are being outsourced in the factory, where they're now being organized much more productively. So in the family, in the bourgeois society, people are still, like, for example, washing clothes, but they're not producing clothes anymore, right? They may be taking care of the sick and the elderly, but they're not producing, creating medicaments. Or they prepare food, but they do not produce food. So the family is still a sphere of consumption, reproduction, but it's no longer a sphere of production. In a way, therefore, the family has been deprived of some of its core economical functions. So the family has become less important or less strong than it had been before, but still it remains extremely necessary, because in the sphere of reproduction, a certain kind of work is organized, and this work is necessary for the reproduction of society. So this work that is not paid with money has to be paid with a different form of currency. And as the Marxist theorist Silvia Federici argued, the currency with which the work in the family is paid is called love. So on the one hand, the family is indispensable, is absolutely necessary, and therefore it's constantly praised on the radio, in TV shows and films as a place of longing. The family is still seen as this place, or the love relationship, at this place where you find belonging, where you find shelter, where you find security, where you can meet your needs for intimacy and so on. On the other hand, the family has long ceased to have the power to fulfill the hopes that are placed in it. And under such high demands, the family regularly collapses. I mean, maybe, like, for example, in Berlin, there's a strong debate around the so-called mafia. And it's very interesting to look at this from this perspective, because now we have all this state representatives from conservative parties who usually praise the family all the time. But now when it comes to the mafia, they are like, okay, the mafia, it's not the families, it's not the clans who can decide what to do, it's still the state, you know, the family is not so important. State is much more important, because in a way that you could say the clans or the mafia, they take the promise of the family verbally. They say, yes, the family has to take care of its members, and therefore we need economical resources. But most of the families don't have these economical resources, because they try to be less criminal. And this is why this promise that the family makes is constantly frustrated. It's something you can see every year in the West, in the Christian West, around this season coming up next in December, the Christmas season. I like to call it the Voldemort season, because I try not to say Christmas anymore. And you could also see that the marriage and the love relation continues to be the norm, even though divorce rates are up to more than 70% in the large cities. Like, I have a friend who works or used to work as a teacher, and he says he has constantly made this experience that if a kid has problems, then it's the teachers sitting together and they say, are their parents divorced? And then they all look very, very sad and say, yes, of course, this child has problems, the parents are divorced. But it's 70% of the parents who are divorced. Still, the norm is that parents remain undivorced, right? So this is like a huge contradiction. On the one hand, the family is needed and is constantly called upon, and there's a huge ideological network in the TVs, radio station, and so on that constantly calls upon the family, and at the same time, the family is unable to meet those needs, to fulfill the promise it makes. And this is like a constant contradiction. And what the right does is to offer a scapegoat for this contradiction. We want family, family is the best thing in the world, still it does not function, it's not happening right, it's an awful social construction. Somebody must be guilty for this, somebody must be responsible. Who is it? Feminists, abortion advocates, and queers. Those are the scapegoats who fill like the gap between the promise of the family and its reality. And I would argue that other right-wing ideologies can be understood in a very similar way. There is a former neo-Nazi in Germany called Christian Ernst Weisgerber, a very, very interesting guy. He used to be a very militant neo-Nazi, an organized fascist, and now has tried to overcome this completely, and has been given a lot of interviews also lately on this, and he said something very interesting also regarding the question how to live in a non-fascist way. He says, at least for somebody who was in a fascist organization, the only way to become non-fascist is to become anti-fascist. It is not enough to be not fascist. If you want people to believe that you have overcome your National Socialist ideologies and networks, you have to publicly denounce them, you have to attack them, you have to give names and so on, addresses, networks to the anti-fascist movement. That's exactly what he has been doing. And he has also been trying to help understand how this fascism works. And also, and this is my question here, what makes it so attractive? And something very interesting he says, talking about also the 1990s in East Germany. He says, in a way, that every work contract and every housing contract is always up for debate. It can always be ended. It is never really secure. It's always precarious. And this is something that you can experience in neoliberal capitalism over and over again. There is no true security. Every contract, even though it might work well for a while, can be ended. But the right ideology says, this is completely different with the gender, with the nation and race. Those are forms of belongings that cannot be ended. They are naturalized and they will remain true and safe for all eternity, or at least for as long as you live. So while the state and so on cannot provide any security, they claim that these naturalized belongings are able to give real security. And the same thing here that we have seen with the family happens again. If my identity is actually secure, when being white and so on, and part of this nation, then how can I explain the persistent anxiety and fear that I constantly have in crisis-ridden capitalism? I am supposed to be safe, still obviously I am not. And the right wing answers, this contradiction comes from the outside, from migrants, from refugees, Muslims, or it comes from within, from those who undermine the nation, Jews above all, but also like filthy green leftists. They are the reason why we cannot feel safe, even though our identity should be essentially safe. But as we all know, fascism does not create security, not even for those to whom it seems to offer security, because, as we have seen from history, its inner logic drives necessarily towards war. This is the situation that we find ourselves in. The danger of fascism is undeniable and truly global. But it is unclear now which promises can be put forth against it when the promises of neoliberalism and the promise of social democracy also find themselves in such a deep crisis. In his book *Sapiens*, this bestseller book *Sapiens*, a brief history of humankind by Israeli historian Yuval Noah Harari, a book that I don't find to be very clever. I think that Harari often has difficulties to understand how modern societies work, but it's still a book that I find very, very helpful, and especially because Harari broadens the perspective so extremely, because as a historian, he's not looking at the picture of the last decade or the last century, but he's looking at the complete human history of the last, 2.5 million years or something like that. And with this perspective, he thinks he can answer the old philosophical question whether the history of humanity has a goal. And he says simply, yes, it has. It is very clear, if you look at it with the perspective from 10 or 20,000 years, that mankind aims for more and more unification. He gives one very clear example. The Roman Empire and the Mayan Empire in the Americas were both big civilizations that had already connected more people with each other than a single person could get to know in their lifetime. But those civilizations had no connections with each other whatsoever. They did not even know of each other's existence, right? Huge civilizations, very complex civilizations that knew nothing about each other. But today we find ourselves in a situation where the United States, North Korea, and Iran, who are supposedly to be very much like enemies or culturally completely different, they rely on exactly the same theories of physics or quantum physics. For example, if they try to build a nuclear bomb, it's exactly the same theories that they're using. And it takes only nanoseconds to exchange their currencies. So if they wanted to make economic exchange, it would be the simplest thing of the world. In this context of this new unification of humankind, this entanglement, global entanglement of humanity, it becomes clear that various concepts handed down from the past no longer make sense. And it's also a reason why, against the danger of fascism, we can no longer reinvent the promises of neoliberalism or social democracy, because they both are rooted deeply in a past that we cannot bring to the present or the future anymore. First of all, the concept that we have to get rid of is the concept of the nation. Because the global economy is intertwined to a new degree, as is the influence of the economy on the global ecological systems. This has become very obvious in the last year through the climate protest movement, Fridays for Future, Extinction Rebellion, and so on. Now everybody knows that climate change affects the entire planet and thus can only be influenced by coordinated efforts across the world. And the same goes true for migration. Questions concerning whether people from one continent should be allowed to come to another continent, say Europe or the US. These questions are already wrong if one assumes that they can be answered by the people or governments of, for example, the Europe or the US. Because thinking that the question of migration could be answered by only the people of Europe or the US would contradict the principles of democracy as such. Because democracy means that decisions are made by those who are affected by them. And the question of migration concerns the people at the point of arrival, say Europe or the US, and as well those of the point of departure, say Latin America or Africa. And it concerns especially those who move in between. So, seen from a democratic standpoint, the question of migration can only be answered from all those people together. Because the principles of democracy allow no hierarchy here, and certainly no exclusion. And this is already true for history. If we remember the French Revolution, the French revolutionaries did not force the king to sign a declaration that said a declaration of French rights. It was a declaration of human rights. And also, the first article of the German Basic Law, the Deutsche Grundgesetz, does not say the dignity of the Germans is inviolable. It says die Würde des Menschen, the dignity of humans. And the same goes true for the American Constitution, which does not begin with the sentence, all Americans are born equal. It states clearly, all men, all human are born equal. This means that the nation is always in contradiction with democracy. There cannot be such a thing as a national democracy. Democracy is from its principle anti-national or transnational or terrestrial, global. This was already true at the time of the birth of the nation in the 18th century, but today even the material conditions of the nation are eroding. The questions of ecology as well as the questions of migration are global questions, and therefore they can only be answered globally. Another concept of the past that no longer functions today is the capitalist economy. It was precisely the capitalist world market that pushed the process of unifying humanity that the Harari describes in an unprecedented level. But capitalism connects people in a very special way, because capitalism connects people only by separating them. How? Because the market only retroactively creates a link between supply and demand through the mediation of goods and money. This means in capitalist society, people do not come together, they do not sit together and talk about which needs they have and how to fulfill these needs and what work is necessary and how this work should be organized in a democratic way. But private production means each producer produces on their own for a demand that they do not know, who they do not cooperate with, and in competition with other producers who they compete with for the limited demand. And this is a structure, a social structure that always forces the economy to grow. It is a structure that forces each and every producer to expand their production under the threat of bankruptcy. You cannot be a capitalist and just get rid of this structural logic, because if you do so, if you become a very ecological and feminist and political correct capitalist and whatsoever, you will go bankrupt. This is the structure of competition in a private production economy. So capitalism entails a constant compulsion to grow. But today, this compulsion to grow, this compulsion for a constant economical growth is reaching its ecological limit. And it's no coincidence, you know, we have always these climate summits that declare like what the politicians are trying to change. But if you look at the numbers, you can never see any strong effect after those climate summits. The only situations when carbon emissions were reduced in the last decades were after economic crisis. First one in the Asian crisis in 1997, and the second decrease of carbon emissions after the World Economic Crisis in 2008-9. And this is, of course, no accident. But capitalism also contains a crisis tendency in a more fundamental sense, because the system of private production for the market means that it is only possible after the fact so retroactively, to determine whether demand actually exists for a product and thus for the labor accompanying it. So the central economic relations that connect people in global capitalism are necessarily precarious. This is a very strange, almost existential condition of life in capitalism, that seen from our basic economical relations, we do not belong to the society just because we are born. It's not you are born, you're welcome, it's nice that you're here, you're a nice person, so you belong to society. No, you always have to prove that you are a valuable member of society, and you prove it through work, and whether the work is valuable or not will only be shown afterwards in the market. So even though you might have been successful as a member of society for quite some time, this is also something that could always be taken away from you again. Except maybe if you have become a billionaire, then maybe you're really on the safe side. But for everybody else, life, your membership to society as such is always precarious. Not only is employment and housing insecure in capitalism, but belonging to society itself. And this is the reason why capitalist relations are fundamentally charged with fear. A fear that neoliberalism has unleashed with new power. And it is exactly this fear to which the right reacts with the promise of irrevocable but exclusive belonging to the race, to the nation, to the family. Here, I would suggest to build on an insight from John D'Amelio. If anti-feminism and anti-queer hostility repeatedly emerge from the contradiction between the ideology of the family and its reality, then the material basis of sexist hatred can only be dissolved if alternative models to family and money relations are developed. This is the argument that D'Amelio makes, and I think it's very valid. A better educational system and a stronger struggle on political ideology alone will never be able to solve this problem, because these ideologies come from the basic contradictions in our social relations. This is why we can only overcome these ideologies and this practice by changing the relations in which we live. The same goes for nationalism and racism. If they make an offer to exclusive and armed security against the competition of the market, they can only be countered through the reconstruction of our economic relations. Only an economy based on solidarity can effectively reduce generalized fear. So, to summarize, the global economic crisis 10 years ago severely damaged the neoliberal promise of individual success through competition and the market. And it is against this backdrop there has returned the ugly promise of group success through competition between genders, nations, and races. In addition, the Fordist promise, the social democratic promise of enjoying growth in exchange for subordination, cannot be repeated due to economical and ecological reasons. In view of the imminent climate catastrophe, we know that further growth is no longer an option. Economists assume that the world economy will face new crises. They are pretty sure the crisis of 2008 will not have been the last crisis, even though that economists tend to forget this as long as it works nicely. But we can be sure that the next global economical crisis will come. And it might be, or probably, it's very probable that the next crisis will be even stronger, because the large public loans that were used to combat the last crisis will become the engines of the next crisis. These loans were even bigger than the credit system before 2008. So I would claim that none of the capitalist models, that is the fascist model, the Fordist model, or the neoliberal model, can provide any answers in this situation. Because in the end, they are all based on competition, whether competition of individuals or groups. There's like a slight difference between the neoliberal ideology and the fascist ideology. They are both based on competition, but neoliberalism is based more on individual competition. Of course, there's still competition between the nations and the states and so on, but it's not so much in the focus of ideology. And the fascist conservatist ideology focuses more on group competition, competition between genders, races, nations. Now that further growth is prohibited from an ecological point of view, cooperation must take the place of competition, just as democratic commons must take the place of private ownership of means of production. So we have to get rid of competition and create a new model for our social relations. Because the ways in which the dominant ideologies that I've been talking about try to overcome fear or try to battle fear are never and can never be successful. The hope of securing one's own privileges through the violent exclusion of others cannot be realized under the conditions of global interdependency, or can only be realized by a very high price, and of course fascists are willing to pay this price. But real security does not consist in sleeping behind an alarm system, does not consist in building higher walls and stronger borders between nations. But real security consists in not having to be afraid of others at all. But this is hardly possible as long as the basic relationships through which we are connected are based on indifference and competition. Hence, the only promise that is still convincing today is the promise of a universal solidarity. A universal solidarity that does not end at the borders of private property or the nation state. Against the fear that is permanently generated by the capitalist mode of production, this promise of universal solidarity aims exactly at security, at true security. And this means a security that is not limited to the few, but states that it is a security for everybody, for all of us. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bini. That was wonderful. The end of your talk really reminded me of one of Adorno's dictums. The goal of the revolution is the abolition of fear. I think this was a talk that was not only very rich in itself, but also very rich in resonances within the context of this day, with Johannes, Transformella Malor, but also in relation to Tom Hollert's lecture yesterday, for instance. Tom discussed the operational, performative nature of fascist language, of fascist discourse. And of course, you discussed the role also played by these fascist, neo-fascist promises, right? It's basically defending what you have by disenfranchising others. It's a brilliant analysis also of the underlying logic of the binarism of the culture wars, right? Us against them, maintaining or recreating binaries in terms of gender, nation, race, and what have you. I'm sure that we don't have an endless amount of time, so actually I think I will hand it over to the audience straight away, because I'm sure there are quite a few questions, comments, and like I said yesterday, I don't want to be that terrible person hogging the microphone and monopolizing the conversation. Yes, are there any questions, comments, thoughts? Or is it once again a matter of a process of percolation and cogitation that takes some time? I can make a start, sure. Okay, then I will be that person. I end up being typecast in that role. Yeah, perhaps a question about sort of, let's say, scale, right? Scaling, upscaling, because clearly toward the end of your talk, it is clear, right, that when we talk about the need to live otherwise, to create different relations, different relational forms, Beziehungsweisen, when we need to replace competition by cooperation, etc. Well, we have to start somewhere, clearly, and we should probably start with ourselves and our immediate environments. But ultimately, it's not enough to try to create sort of pockets, right? Beautiful autonomous zones, right? This needs to be upscaled, clearly. Do you have any maybe further thoughts about the relation, if you will, between working in one's immediate sort of milieu and networks on the one hand, but also using that as a kind of lever to effect a social change that needs to be a societal change, indeed.
Well, I try to answer this question or discuss this question in retrospect to history, and this means especially here in the history of the left. And I try to work with the comparison between the old left, which is mostly rooted in 1917, the Russian Revolution, and the new left, which I have been talking a bit about today, which is rooted in 1968. And I think the new left and the old left, they form like two positions in this questions, whether we have to start with our own lives and in our individual situation, the microcosm of our social relations, the community, or whether we have to try to change first the state to make a huge revelation, and then from this starting point on, change our individual or our smaller situations. And I think that both answers, having them in this pure fashion, can only be wrong, right? Because I think it was also Marcuse who said, you should never trust anybody who says, first we have to make a huge revolution, we have to change everything, and then afterwards we can become nice persons. They only try to legitimize their own evilness, or let's say laziness, or whatever. But at the same time, if you don't push for more than your little communities, you will find yourself pretty soon in a situation where you should realize that you are stuck. I think it can be very nicely, but very clearly be seen in increase in the economical crisis, in the situation of economic crisis. As I said, it is a situation where many people realize their own situation is no longer disconnected from the situation of others, but they realize we are all in the same situation, so our only possibility is to fight it off together. So they come together on a big squares, they discuss publicly, and they start to form unions of solidarity. They create initiatives of solidaric economy to struggle with this economic and social and political crisis. For example, they come together and they say, in a solidaric fashion, we will take care of each other, our medical situations, but without hierarchies, without the market, without wage, but in a solidaric fashion. But at the same time, it was clear that as long as the European Union and the European Central Bank remained to their austerity position, these experiments remained restricted to like some form of helping each other, but in a condition of economical poorness, right? So it was clear that the ideal, the promise of solidarity can only be realized if the big or the other social relations, the relation of the market, the relation between Greece and the European Union, the relation in the global economy are also attacked and changed. And it's also what the movement tried, but of course they suffered a huge defeat. And this is also the reason why these solidaric institutions remain active. But of course they don't look so utopian anymore, but very restricted.
Yeah, there's a question here. Yeah.
For a lot of people, security is a prison. For other part of the people, security is self-trust. What do you mean with your word security?
I mean, in 1968, the revolutionaries, they were in a way fighting off this idea of security, because they realized that this security, this social security, say health insurance, a secured job, a stable family situation and so on, is in fact a prison, a bureaucratic prison in which it's hard to breathe, because every step is already decided for you and before you are even asked how you want to live. This is why the new left focused so much on freedom, on liberty, on autonomy, on flexibility, creativity, and so on and so forth. But what we could see is that the neoliberal counter-revolution took this power, took this energy, took this criticism of security and transformed it into a capitalist force that transformed the longing for freedom into the reality of flexibilization. And now you are not allowed to be flexible. Now you are forced to be flexible, and not under the chosen conditions of the community, but under the conditions of capital. In a way, now you can decide when you want to work, if you want to work early shift or late shift, or if you want to work at the weekend, but there is still a deadline, and the deadline is set by the capital, is set by the industrial, by the boss. So this flexibilization is not true freedom, and it becomes clear that true freedom or flexibility or liberty cannot be gained individually, but only collectively. Only when we come together, we can collectively set the rules under which we want to live. And this, of course, would be then a situation of security and not individual freedom and insecurity.
Collective cannot be a small group.
No, collective has to be a bigger group.
Back to questions of scale and micro and macro. Yeah, Diana.
Yeah, so Bini, it's wonderful, as always, to just soak in some of your brilliance. But I would like to ask you about the difference between, or if you could go into something around the difference between solidarity, international solidarity, and localized solidarity, what it means. For example, I think just amongst the back fellows here, there are people that are constantly getting updates on what's happening in Lebanon or out on the streets here in Utrecht with strikes against the Black Peter demonstrations tomorrow. So it's our whole deserting from the culture wars program has been constantly getting updates from other culture wars, and that there's something which is very localized, but something that's also in solidarity with all kinds of other places. Because this is something which it seems to me that on the one hand it's easy to locate politics elsewhere, as if the real struggles are somewhere else and you can be on that side or not on that side, I don't know, a moralist, this or that, but that one can also have a lived, localized politics that is as collective as possible within those kind of conditions, that one can support this or that place because they have better practices, better payment schedules, etc. One can support people that organize and unionize and strike and so on. So one can do all kinds of things in order to try to form solidarities and still be in solidarity elsewhere? Because I think there's this difference between globalization and internationalism, that kind of like the globalization is what is kind of in the service of capital and pits basically individual against individual. But how do you reclaim like an internationalism that's also not just far away, that's also local? And that's, I don't know, I don't expect you to be able to answer that. Maybe you could reflect on that.
Thanks. Let me try to first think about why solidarity itself has become such a strong topic lately in the current situation. Because I would argue that it is so strong because it provides the precise answer that is needed in the neoliberal condition of fragmentation and the destruction of relationality itself, right? Because the neoliberal situation is a situation of individualization, of atomization, of singularity. And it's a situation of high inequality. And this is exactly where solidarity comes in, because solidarity is a claim for a form of relation, for a mode of relation that is not based on equality. It's not based on the assumption that we find ourselves in equal or even the same living conditions. This was like the idea of the old left. We come together because we have the same interests. We realize we have the same interests, therefore we fight together. But solidarity means that our starting points can be extremely different and even unequal. But our aim is to realize equality. We try to become equal. We are not equal, but we want to become equal. So a solidaric relation tries to change the relations we find ourselves in. It builds bridges where there are no bridges, where relations have been cut. And it tries to build bridges of equality. And this also means that solidarity opposes hierarchies and also like hierarchical forms of solidarity. So solidarity is like, it's not a one-way ticket. It can or longs to go in both directions. And I think, for example, it was very beautifully seen in the Arab uprisings, when in Egypt demonstrators were on a demonstration holding signs in solidarity with the workers of Wisconsin, USA. It was also when it's like Subcommandante Marcos gave a talk in Italy, and he received a fee, I don't know, 400 or 600 euros, and then he gave the fee to the workers of Turin, of a factory in Italy. And of course, those actions, they play on our ideas of how solidarity is supposed to work in one way, but it claims to work in both directions. And I think that this is the strength of solidarity, that it can create relations where there are no relations yet, and it claims to create concrete relations. So it's not enough to just send money somewhere, but the relations between, let's say, for example, those in the south or in the north, for example, because there the differences are very, very strong, have to change. And sometimes it exactly happens in the process of solidarity movement that it goes in both directions, that the protesters like occupying Wall Street learn from the Arab Spring, and at the same time people in Egypt are solidaric with the people in the US. And then something new happens.
Yeah, Maria? Yeah.
Thank you, Bini. This was fantastic. I just have perhaps a quick question, and that's the question, where on that scheme of neither social democracy, nor neoliberalism, nor fascism stands communism? So where do I place this? Where do I place communism?
Well, in a way, I would suggest to place communism also as a movement of historical self-critique, right? The next step would be, and this is also why I think I did not use the word, but try to describe what is supposed to mean. The next step, of course, in this argument would do the same historical critique or critique of historialization with the communist movement itself. And it would show that the communist promise of creating solidaric relations was not met in history, because either was communism destroyed in an authoritarian fashion when the ideal of equality transformed into an ideal of homogenization, or the communist ideal was not met because the ideal of freedom, of liberty, transformed into sectarianism, into dissolvement of community. And this is also why this communist promise can never remain the same. There is not one promise that has been made, I don't know, in the matriarchy or by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels that can just remain the same. But since historical conditions change, so has our idea of a better life changed, and has also to change. And the question of the ecological limits of growth and the question of the ending of the nation state are also questions that any transformative perspective, let's say communist perspective, has to face. Because on the one hand, it is very clear that the socialist ideal of internationalism or terrestrialism was betrayed by nationalism in the history of social democracy, in the history of socialism and communism. And also, we can make a very strong argument claiming that the ecological crisis can never be overcome under capitalism, because capitalism has this compulsive need for growth. So ecological movement has to be eco-socialist movement or eco-communist movement. But it's also very clear that those states who claim to be communist were not ecological at all, but were destroying nature in a very, very deep sense of the term. And this is like a heritage that you have to work through to make clear exactly what you mean and how that what you're longing for differs from the, let's say, mistakes that have been made in the past. So communism cannot remain true to itself. There is no clear identity as a process, and we have to adapt to the situation.
It's interesting to me, though, that currently in the United States, in particular, as part of the ongoing culture wars, right, there is the tendency, there is really a coordinated policy, it seems, to try to discredit certain politicians and activists by stating that they're communists or socialists, or more broadly speaking, the radical left, right, the radical extreme left, which I think is actually maybe a positive sign, a sign that there is real concern here, that actually there is an emancipatory movement that is building, and that there is an alternative promise, actually, an alternative promise that may be getting increasingly attractive to a larger number of people, right? And in that sense, I would say that the very rhetoric, the hate-filled rhetoric about the radical left is a sign that there is a sense here that there's real competition brewing, to put it in capitalist terms.
Yeah, Want me to comment? Yeah, I mean.
Maybe actually, how are we running? Are we running out of time? Should we end it on this note? Is there room, time, space-time for a final question, or what's the consensus? Yeah? 5 minutes? Okay. So, this is your chance. I mean, you might have another, yeah? Yes.
Thank you. I wonder what do you think is the role, because also your talk talks about the promise, and you also introduced that, like when talking about Harari, about the common goal of humanity, and there's a certain desire. I wonder what you think is the role of psychoanalysis and a certain kind of ever out of reach subject that neoliberalism and fascism are quite successful in projecting, in a sense that you always follow a certain carrot in front of the stick. Or when you think about the family, that ideal image, and there you externalize the contradictories of reaching this ideal, whereas maybe with neoliberalism you internalize the contradiction by blaming yourself for not having made it, or like so I wonder what is, when we think about desire as a kind of motivating force, what could we desire and how that relates to maybe also different identities and also to the self when we want to build new relations.
For me, these, and you already mentioned them, these new rebellions that are happening all over the world are always, again and again, so fascinating, because never ever has any theorist in revolution been able to predict these uprisings. Yet again, they happen, and the people bring their desires onto the street. And while doing so, desiring a better world, more security, or mostly self-determination, they also realize, or they create the conditions for the realization that desire is in a way not rooted in the subject. It's not rooted in the individual, and therefore we could also argue is not rooted so much in the social, or entirely or dominantly in the social relation that the psychoanalytic tradition holds to be most important, the nuclear family. Right? But that desire is also something that happens in other relations, is created in relations and changed and transformed in relations that only come into being in these revolts, that are created in these uprisings. It is this realization that there is no individual core, but there's a deep connection, and that we are in our desire deeply connected to each other. It's something also that came, I think, very clear in a recent book that has the nice title, "Why Women Had Better Sex Under Socialism." And it works with a very simple survey that scientists, East German scientists, conveyed in the late 1980s, where they asked people, especially like people living as women in East Germany and West Germany, how their experiences in sexuality were, how often they had orgasms, or if they were happy with sexuality in general. And the results of the differences between East and West are striking. Yes, this is like, let's say 40% of the people living as women in West Germany are satisfied with their sexuality, whereas in East Germany it's 70, 80, 90%, something like this. It's crazy. And of course this was not a socialist state in any way I would promote the term, but still there's a huge difference. So the question is, why is the difference so strong? You could say one strong argument is that there is no commodification of female sexuality, of female body, which of course makes sexuality much easier if you don't have to think all the time if you're pretty, but can concentrate on what you really long for. And there's no commodification of sexuality whatsoever. Strangely, also, you can see that in the GDR there's not so much jealousy. But I think there's another point would be that the people had not so much to do. So sex was something they did because they were bored. And then a third argument I would say is that that security, social security, was not seen to be rooted in the family, in the love relation. But that social security, in a very boring fashion, was already met by this very strong socialist welfare state. So the sexual relations did not have the job to fulfill this need for security, and therefore they were somehow liberated from this burden. And I think it's a very strong point to show that our the most inner desire, the most intimacy desires can be changed very drastically in very short time. The GDR only existed for, I don't know, 40 years or something, right? It's nothing. But still, the way how we experience our most inner desires, how we experience sexuality, how we experience intimacy changes just by changing the bigger social relations. And I think we always have to see this inner connection between them. This is what is most intimate and what is most anonymous, the biggest picture. It's very much connected.
I think these are good closing words, but of course I would also like to emphasize that Bini will be back tomorrow on our panel together with Natasha Zadahagigian and Jonas Stahl, and I'm very much looking forward to that, and I hope to welcome many of you again. Yeah, see you tomorrow, hopefully, and thank you very much once again, Bini, and also Johannes.
Thank you.